The great chamber stretched out like a small world made of metal and light, where thousands of alien beings gathered in circles that rose up toward a ceiling lost in shadows, and the air hummed with the voices of creatures from across the galaxy, speaking in languages that sounded like music or thunder, or the whisper of wind through crystal caves. At the center of this vast space floated a sphere of pure energy that pulsed with different colors as each speaker took their turn and around. This sphere sat the most powerful beings in known space who called themselves the Galactic Council and who had ruled over 847 different species for more years than most civilizations could count. The Velthari representative looked like a walking mountain of blue crystal that sang when it moved, and its voice rang out clear and cold as winter air as it spoke about the newest problem that faced their perfect order. And this problem had a name that many of the Council members had never heard before, but would soon learn to fear Earth. The files appeared in the air above the energy sphere, showing a small blue and green planet that spun slowly in the darkness of space, and the data scrolled past in streams of light that told the story of a young species that had just learned to travel between the stars, and who seemed to know nothing about the greater galaxy that waited for them. The Morden delegate shifted its gaseous form into something that might have been a nod if it had possessed a head, and spoke in a voice like distant thunder about how this species called humans had developed faster than light travel in less than 100 of their years after splitting the atom, and how they had built ships that could cross vast distances and were already sending scouts to nearby star systems. The crystal being sang a note of agreement and explained how their scouts had watched these humans for several of their generations and had seen them grow from primitive creatures who fought with sticks and stones to beings who could harness the power of their star and build machines that could think and learn and create. But what worried the Council most was not what humans had already achieved, but what they might achieve if left to grow without proper guidance and control, because every species that reached the stars faced the same choice between wisdom and destruction, and most chose destruction unless the Council stepped in to help them find the right path. The Zephyrian ambassador, who looked like a tree made of silver light and moved like wind through grass, spoke about the protocols that had kept peace in the galaxy for so long, and how every new species must be evaluated and guided according to their potential for growth and their danger to the established order protocol. 7 had been used 43 times in the past 1,000 years and had never failed to bring a new species into the galactic community as peaceful and productive members who contributed to the greater good while accepting their place in the natural hierarchy that kept chaos from destroying everything that had been built. The process was simple and had been refined over centuries of careful practice, where the Council would approach a new species with gifts of technology and knowledge while gradually making them dependent on Council resources and guidance until they could not imagine existing without the wisdom and protection that only the Council could provide. First came the establishment of monitoring stations in their home system disguised as research facilities that would study their culture and psychology while identifying their leaders and learning their weaknesses and strengths, and the best ways to approach them with offers of friendship and cooperation. Then came the careful introduction of Council technology that would seem like miraculous advances to primitive minds, but would actually be simplified versions of much older inventions that included hidden restrictions and dependencies that would prevent the new species from developing their own advanced science or becoming truly independent. The Council had learned long ago that species who developed too quickly or were allowed too much freedom often became dangerous to themselves and others, and history was full of civilizations that had destroyed themselves with weapons they were not wise enough to control or had spread across the galaxy, like a plague consuming everything in their path. The Velthari sang another crystal note and reminded the assembly of the Korthak incident, where a species had been allowed to develop without guidance and had nearly destroyed an entire sector before. The Council had been forced to take more direct action, and how that tragedy had led to the creation of the current protocols that prevented such disasters. The human files continued to scroll through the air, showing cities that stretched across continents and ships that moved between planets and weapons that could crack worlds and a population that numbered in the billions and was growing faster than any species the Council had ever encountered. What made humans especially concerning was their apparent tendency toward what their own philosophers called individualism, where each person believed they had the right to make their own choices and follow their own path instead of accepting the wisdom of those who knew better, and this kind of thinking had led to chaos and war throughout their short history. The Council had seen this pattern before, in species that valued personal freedom over social order and collective wisdom, and such species either learned to accept proper guidance or eventually destroyed themselves through the endless conflicts that arose when everyone believed their own ideas were as good as anyone else's. The Morden delegate shifted its form again and spoke about the military assessment that showed humans had already developed weapon systems that were surprisingly advanced for such a young species, and had organized their defenses in ways that suggested they expected trouble from someone, even though they had never encountered another intelligent species. Their ships were built with heavy armor and powerful engines and carried weapons that seemed designed for fighting enemies with technology similar to their own, which suggested a level of paranoia and preparation that was unusual in species that had never faced external threats. The psychological profiles painted a picture of beings who were creative and adaptable, but also aggressive and unpredictable, and who seemed to view every challenge as something to be overcome through determination and clever thinking rather than accepting that some problems required wisdom and patience to solve properly. The Zephyrian ambassador rustled its silver leaves and pointed out that humans had already shown they could work together when faced with common threats as evidenced by their response to natural disasters and global challenges. But this same cooperation could be turned toward dangerous purposes if they were allowed to unite against what they might see as outside interference. The debate continued for hours as representative after representative spoke about the need for immediate action before humans could spread beyond their home system and become too powerful to guide properly, and several delegates shared stories of other species that had been successfully integrated using Protocol 7. The crystal being sang a complex melody that translated roughly to a formal proposal that the Council vote to implement immediate intervention in the human home system with the goal of establishing monitoring stations and beginning the gradual process of technological dependency and cultural guidance that would ensure humans took their proper place in galactic civilization. The vote was called, and delegates throughout the Great Chamber signaled their agreement with lights that flashed in patterns unique to each species until the entire space looked like a constellation of stars that pulsed and flickered in rhythm with voices that spoke in unity. About the wisdom of this decision, 847 species voted as one to approve Protocol 7 for the human homeworld, designated as Earth in the third spiral arm of what humans called the Milky Way galaxy, and the Council began making preparations to send their most experienced diplomatic and military personnel to begin the integration process. The fleets were assembled from the finest ships in Council space, including heavy cruisers that could establish orbital control, and transport vessels that could carry the monitoring equipment and personnel needed to begin the long process of bringing humans into the galactic community. As the Great Chamber began to empty and delegates departed to carry word of this decision back to their homeworlds, none of them noticed the small maintenance bot that moved quietly between the seats, collecting debris and data chips that had been dropped during the session. The bot worked its way systematically through the vast space, cleaning and organizing while its sensors recorded everything and transmitted compressed data bursts to a relay station hidden in the shadows of the station's outer hull, where the signals were processed and forwarded through a network of communication devices that eventually reached a ship floating in the darkness between stars. In that ship, a man named Kang Tae-min sat quietly reading the reports that flowed across his screen and occasionally making notes on a tablet while his crew of humans worked at stations around him, monitoring Council communications and tracking the movement of ships throughout this sector of space. When the final transmission arrived, confirming that the Council had voted to implement Protocol 7 against Earth, Kang Tae-min stood up and walked to the communications station where he began composing a message that would be transmitted on Council frequencies using proper diplomatic protocols. The message was simple, and the silence that followed Kang Tae-min's transmission lasted exactly 17 seconds, according to the chronometer displays throughout the Council station, but to the thousands of beings who had just heard a human voice speaking their sacred, diplomatic language, those 17 seconds felt like hours of frozen time. The Velthari representative's crystal form stopped singing entirely and stood motionless like a statue carved from blue ice, while the Mordun delegate's gaseous body contracted into a tight sphere that pulsed with confused colors, and throughout the great chamber, voices rose in what might have been panic, if such dignified beings ever allowed themselves to panic. Security alerts began flashing throughout the massive station, as automated systems tried to locate the source of the unauthorized transmission and failed because the signal had come from inside their own communication network, using proper codes and protocols that should have been impossible for any unauthorized being to possess. Admiral Zentara of the Council Fleet felt her four hearts stop beating for a moment when the message reached her flagship because she had been preparing her crews for a simple diplomatic mission to contact a primitive species, and suddenly found herself wondering how those primitives had learned to speak Galactic Standard and had acquired the communication codes needed to contact Council vessels. The human voice had been calm and polite and had used the exact phrases required by diplomatic protocol when requesting a formal audience with Council representatives. But the implications of what they had just heard were staggering, because it meant humans already knew about the Council and had somehow infiltrated their most secure facilities. Kang Tae-min waited patiently for a response while his ship maintained its position in the shadow of a dead moon, where Council sensors could not detect them, and his crew continued their quiet work of monitoring Council communications and preparing for the next phase of their carefully planned operation. The man himself was unremarkable by human standards, with dark hair that was beginning to show gray at the temples and clothes that would not have looked out of place in any human city. But his calm expression and steady hands suggested someone who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. Behind him, Lee So-ra sat at the linguistics station where screens displayed real-time translations of Council communications in dozens of alien languages, and her fingers moved quickly across holographic keyboards as she analyzed the emotional content and hidden meanings in the panicked chatter that was flowing through Council networks. She was younger than Kang Tae-min, with bright eyes that missed nothing, and a scholar's patience for detail that had made her one of humanity's foremost experts on alien psychology and communication, even though most of the galaxy had never heard of her species. Until this moment, at the tactical station Park Ji-woo reviewed fleet positions and defensive capabilities with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years studying Council military doctrine and had found it predictable and rigid in ways that could be exploited by opponents who understood the importance of flexibility and adaptation. The Council's response came in the form of a demand for immediate identification and explanation transmitted on emergency frequencies that carried the authority of 847 civilizations, speaking in unity about their outrage at this unprecedented breach of security and protocol. Kang Tae-min smiled slightly as he read the message because it contained exactly the mixture of arrogance and confusion he had expected, and he began composing his reply while Lee So-ra provided real-time cultural context about the best ways to approach each species without triggering their various psychological defense mechanisms. The second transmission was longer and more detailed and began with formal introductions according to the proper diplomatic protocols that humans had learned through years of careful observation and study of Council procedures and customs. Kang Tae-min identified himself as the designated representative of the human species and requested a formal audience with the Council leadership to discuss matters of mutual interest and concern in accordance with the established procedures for first contact between civilized species. He also provided coordinates for a meeting location that would be neutral and secure, and suggested that both sides bring appropriate security personnel and recording equipment so that their historic first meeting could be properly documented for the archives of both civilizations. The Council's response was immediate and harsh and demanded that humans explain how they had acquired classified communication codes and infiltrated Council space without authorization, and warned that such actions could be considered acts of war against the established galactic order. But underneath the official outrage, Council leaders were beginning to realize that they faced a situation unlike anything in their previous experience, because humans had clearly been preparing for this contact for much longer than anyone had suspected, and had demonstrated capabilities that their intelligence reports had never mentioned. Emergency sessions were called throughout the Council station, as leaders tried to understand how their supposedly perfect intelligence network had failed so completely and how a primitive species had managed to penetrate their most secure facilities without detection. The Velthari sang nervous melodies about the need for caution and careful evaluation, while the Mordun delegate suggested that immediate military action might be necessary to prevent humans from sharing council secrets with other species who might use such information for dangerous purposes. Meanwhile, security teams searched every deck and compartment of the massive station looking for signs of human infiltration and found nothing except for a few maintenance bots that seemed to be working normally and showed no signs of tampering or modification. What they did not know was that those maintenance bots had been broadcasting detailed information about council operations for months, and that human engineers led by Choi Min-ho had designed monitoring systems so subtle and sophisticated that they were virtually undetectable by conventional security scans. Choi Min-ho himself was working quietly in a research facility on the outer rim of council space where he had been studying alien technology for 3 years, while disguised as a member of a species that the council barely bothered to monitor because they were considered harmless and primitive. His work had provided humans with complete technical specifications for council ships and weapons and defensive systems, and had revealed weaknesses and limitations that could be exploited if peaceful contact failed and military action became necessary. On another world, Kim Hae-jin was finishing her assignment as a cultural exchange student, where she had learned council languages and customs and had made friends among several species who were growing tired of council control, but had never dared to speak openly about their desire for independence. Her reports had given humans detailed insights into the political tensions and social problems that existed throughout council space, and had identified potential allies who might support human proposals for changes to the existing galactic order. The council finally agreed to meet with human representatives, but only after implementing additional security measures that included psychic scans and molecular analysis and energy field detectors that they believed would reveal any hidden weapons or surveillance equipment. The meeting was scheduled to take place in a heavily guarded conference room deep inside the council station where every word would be recorded and analyzed, and where the most powerful beings in the galaxy would finally come face to face with the species that had somehow managed to surprise them. Kong Tai-min arrived at the appointed time, accompanied by Lee So-ra and Park Ji-woo, and submitted to the required security procedures with patient cooperation, while council censors examined them from every possible angle and found nothing more dangerous than standard diplomatic equipment. The 3 humans were escorted through corridors lined with guards from a dozen different species and past security checkpoints that would have stopped armies, but they walked calmly and appeared completely at ease, as if they were simply visiting friends rather than entering the heart of an alien civilization. When they finally entered the conference room, the assembled council members were struck by how ordinary the humans appeared, to be because they had expected something more impressive or threatening from a species that had demonstrated such unexpected capabilities. Lee So-ra spoke first using perfect pronunciation in each delegate's native language as she offered formal greetings according to the customs of their respective species, and her knowledge of alien etiquette was so complete that several representatives were visibly surprised. She explained that humans had been aware of galactic civilization for several decades and had been studying council procedures and protocols while preparing for the day when they would be ready to request membership in the galactic community as equals rather than subjects. The word equals caused a stir throughout the room, because no species had ever requested membership as equals, and the entire structure of galactic civilization was based on the principle that older and wiser species naturally guided younger and less experienced ones. The emergency council session lasted 18 hours, as delegates from 847 species debated what to do about the human problem, and voices rose in anger and fear as the implications of their failed intelligence became clear to everyone in the Great Chamber. The Velthari sang harsh discordant notes about the need to test human resolve before making any permanent decisions, while the Mordun delegate pulsed with dark colors as it spoke about the danger of allowing even one species to challenge the established order that had kept peace for millennia. General Korthak of the warrior caste stood before the assembly like a mountain of armored flesh and bone and spoke in a voice like grinding stone about how his people had never failed to subdue a new species, and how a quick demonstration of council military superiority would solve the human problem once and for all. The Korthak were the Council's ultimate solution to species that refused to accept guidance. Because they were bred for war and had conquered dozens of worlds for the greater good of galactic civilization, and their very existence served as a reminder of what happened to those who rejected Council wisdom. Their ships were massive and heavily armed, and their warriors were trained from birth to fight with weapons and tactics that had proven effective against every form of resistance they had ever encountered. And they took pride in the fact that most species surrendered rather than face them in battle. The vote to authorize a limited military action was closer than usual, but passed when several fence-sitting species decided that allowing humans to continue their defiance would encourage other species to question Council authority and potentially lead to widespread rebellion throughout their territory. The target chosen for this demonstration was the human colony on New Sol, which intelligence reports described as a typical agricultural settlement with a few thousand colonists, and minimal defensive capabilities that would provide an excellent example of what happened to humans who refused to accept proper guidance. 3 Korthak battlecruisers departed from their home base, carrying elite warriors who expected to complete their mission within hours and return with prisoners and captured technology that would help the Council understand how humans had developed such unexpected capabilities. The ships arrived at New Sol after a journey of several days and found exactly what their intelligence reports had described, which was a peaceful farming community built around a small city that showed no signs of military fortification or advanced defensive systems. Nam Dong-wook was working in his office at the Colonial Administration Building when the alert came through his communication system, and he looked up from reports about crop yields and water allocation to see 3 alien warships entering orbit around his world. He was a quiet man who had volunteered for colonial service because he wanted to help build something new and better away from the crowded cities of Earth, but his personnel file contained information that the Korthak intelligence officers had not bothered to read carefully. 20 years earlier, he had been one of Earth's most decorated military commanders and had earned his reputation fighting in conflicts that had tested every aspect of his tactical knowledge and leadership abilities before retiring to pursue a peaceful life among the stars. The colonial militia that assembled in response to his emergency call consisted of farmers and engineers and teachers who had left their old lives behind to build new communities, but many of them had military backgrounds and had maintained their training because living on frontier worlds required constant preparation for unexpected dangers. Song Yunbi left her medical clinic and reported to the militia headquarters, where she began organizing field hospitals and evacuation procedures for civilians while reviewing the tactical situation and preparing for casualties that everyone hoped would not occur. She had served as a combat medic in 3 different conflicts before becoming a civilian doctor, but her hands remained steady under pressure, and her knowledge of battlefield medicine was as sharp as ever, even though she had hoped never to use it again. Oh Kyung-soo arrived at the command center, carrying a worn tactical computer that he had modified with civilian components to analyze enemy movements and communications, and within minutes he was tracking the Korthak ships and predicting their likely attack patterns. His background in military intelligence had made him valuable to the colonial government as a security advisor, but he had spent most of his time helping farmers protect their crops from native wildlife rather than preparing for alien invasion. The Korthak landing began at dawn with assault shuttles descending from orbit in perfect formation, while their warriors sang battle hymns that had echoed across 100 conquered worlds and their weapons charged with energy that could burn through any known armor. What they found waiting for them was not the terrified resistance of civilians who had never faced professional warriors, but a coordinated defense that anticipated their movements and countered their tactics with a flexibility and creativity that they had never encountered before. Nam Dong-wook had divided his forces into small units that could move quickly through terrain that had been prepared in advance, with hidden weapons caches and communication relays and escape routes that allowed militia fighters to appear and disappear like ghosts. The Korthak had fought enemies who relied on superior numbers or advanced technology or natural advantages, but they had never faced opponents who seemed to understand their psychology and tactical doctrine better than they understood it themselves. Song Yunbi moved between defensive positions treating wounded fighters, and helping coordinate evacuations while maintaining constant communication with civilian shelters and providing medical advice that saved lives and kept the militia fighting effectively. Her knowledge of Korthak anatomy and physiology helped the defenders target vulnerable points on alien armor, while her experience with trauma medicine allowed her to keep badly wounded fighters in action long enough to complete their missions. Kyung-soo analyzed enemy communication patterns and predicted their next moves with an accuracy that amazed even experienced military officers, because he understood that successful tactics required knowing not just what the enemy could do, but what they were likely to do based on their training and culture. The battle lasted 3 days instead of the few hours that the Korthak had expected, and with each passing hour their confidence turned to confusion and then to something approaching. Fear, as human defenders continued to outmaneuver and outthink forces that had never been defeated. On the second day, a Korthak assault team found themselves surrounded in a valley that had seemed like an easy route to their objective but turned out to be a carefully prepared killing ground where concealed weapons could target them from multiple directions. The team leader called for air support, but discovered that his shuttles were being jammed by devices that his technical specialists could not locate or disable. And when he tried to retreat, he found that the humans had somehow blocked the route he had used to enter the valley. What followed was a running battle through terrain that seemed designed to favor the defenders, who used every natural feature and artificial obstacle to their advantage, while the Korthak struggled to adapt to tactics that violated everything they had learned about warfare. On the third day, the remaining Korthak forces received orders to withdraw to their ships and prepare for orbital bombardment of the entire colony because their ground assault had failed to achieve any of its objectives, and continuing the battle would only result in more casualties. But when they tried to return to their landing zones, they discovered that human engineers had somehow captured or destroyed most of their shuttles, and that the remaining vehicles had been sabotaged in ways that made them unreliable for atmospheric flight. The final insult came when Nam Dong-wook contacted the Korthak ships directly using captured communication equipment and offered to allow the surviving warriors to surrender and return to their ships unharmed if they agreed to leave the system immediately and report what they had learned. The Korthak commander faced a choice between accepting this humiliating offer or watching his elite warriors die in a foreign land fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate his every move, and he chose to preserve his forces for future battles. The withdrawal was conducted under human supervision, with militia units providing escort to ensure that no Korthak equipment was left behind that could be used to call for reinforcements or target the colony for future attack. Song Yunbi treated wounded Korthak warriors with the same professional care she gave to human casualties because her medical oath required her to help anyone who needed healing, regardless of their species or their role in the conflict. Kyung-soo analyzed captured Korthak equipment and communication records to understand their command structure and tactical procedures, and forwarded this information to other human colonies so they could prepare for similar attacks. The news of the Korthak defeat spread through Council space faster than official reports could suppress it, and species that had submitted to Council authority for centuries began to whisper about the humans who had fought the elite warriors and won on distant worlds. Beings who had never heard of Earth or humanity began to ask questions about the species that had successfully resisted. The Council War Room had never seen such frantic activity as delegates and military commanders from across the galaxy gathered to plan their response to the humiliation at New Sol, and the air crackled with tension as species that had ruled, unopposed for millennia, faced the possibility that their perfect order might be breaking down. Admiral Veltos commanded the largest fleet ever assembled in Council space, with ships from 40 different species and weapons that could crack planets, and defenses that had never been breached by any known enemy, and he was confident that this overwhelming show of force would end human resistance permanently. The fleet consisted of 2,000 heavy cruisers and escort vessels and troop transports, carrying enough soldiers to occupy every human world, and the firepower concentrated in that armada was sufficient to destroy entire star systems if the humans refused to surrender unconditionally. Intelligence reports indicated that humans had perhaps 50 ships scattered across a dozen colony worlds, and while their recent victory had been impressive, it was clearly the result of superior ground tactics rather than any significant space combat capability. The plan was simple and had worked against every previous enemy, which was to arrive in overwhelming force and demand immediate surrender, while demonstrating their ability to destroy any target that refused to comply with Council demands. What the Council did not know was that human agents had been monitoring their communications and tracking their fleet movements since the moment the first ships left their home ports, and that every detail of their battle plan was known to human commanders long before the Armada reached its first staging area. Han Soo-jin stood on the bridge of her flagship reviewing deployment reports from human vessels throughout Council space, and the numbers on her screens told a story that would have terrified the Council if they had known what they were seeing. 300 human ships had been positioned over the past year at strategic locations throughout the galaxy, and each ship carried weapons and defensive systems that incorporated technology captured from defeated Council forces or developed through decades of careful research. The ships themselves were not impressive by Council standards, because humans had focused on stealth and mobility rather than size and firepower. But their crews were trained to fight with a flexibility and creativity that rigid Council doctrine could not match. Lim Woo-jin sat in his laboratory aboard the research vessel that followed the fleet, analyzing psychological profiles of every major Council species and preparing detailed recommendations for how to approach each civilization when the time came for direct contact. His work had revealed that most Council species were not naturally aggressive or domineering, but had been shaped by centuries of careful conditioning that taught them to accept their place in a hierarchy that benefited only the oldest and most powerful civilizations. Many species had joined the Council not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice when faced with overwhelming military pressure and the promise that cooperation would bring peace and prosperity that they could never achieve alone. The reports that filled his screens contained interviews with thousands of beings from dozens of worlds who had been contacted by human agents and asked about their experiences under Council rule and their hopes for the future. What emerged from this data was a picture of widespread dissatisfaction with the existing order and a growing desire for change among species that had been silent for too long about their grievances and frustrations. Bae Young Mai worked at the Cultural Analysis Station, where she processed reports from human operatives who had spent years living among alien civilizations and learning their languages and customs and political structures. Her files contained detailed maps of trade routes and communication networks and supply lines that kept the Council empire functioning, and her analysis had identified critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited to disrupt Council operations without causing unnecessary suffering. The most important discovery was that the Council's power depended entirely on their ability to coordinate the activities of hundreds of different species, and that this coordination required constant communication and careful timing that could be disrupted by opponents who understood the system. Admiral Han Soo-jin sent her message to every Council world simultaneously using their own communication networks to ensure that no government could suppress or distort her words, and her calm voice carried across the galaxy, speaking in dozens of languages. The message was simple and direct, and began with a formal request for recognition of humanity as an independent, stellar nation with the right to govern its own affairs and establish relationships with other species based on mutual respect and voluntary cooperation. She explained that humans had no desire to conquer or dominate other civilizations, but would not accept subjugation or control by any external authority, and that they were prepared to defend their independence with whatever force might be necessary. What followed was a demonstration that changed forever the way the galaxy thought about warfare and power, because human ships did not attack Council targets, but simply appeared everywhere at once in positions that made attack impossible. Every Council homeworld found human vessels in their orbit not threatening or aggressive, but clearly capable of delivering devastating strikes against any target they chose, and the message was unmistakable. That Council military superiority was an illusion. Every military installation and supply depot and communication relay throughout Council space discovered that humans had been watching and planning and preparing for this moment, and that their supposedly secret facilities were known and vulnerable. The psychological impact was devastating, because Council leaders realized that their enemy had been studying them for years and had penetrated their most secure operations while remaining completely undetected by intelligence services that had never failed before. Lim Woo-jin's second broadcast went to species that had been forced to submit to council authority against their will, and his message offered them something they had never dared to hope for, which was the possibility of freedom from the system that had controlled their lives for generations. He spoke in their native languages, using cultural references and historical examples that showed he understood their specific grievances and aspirations, and he offered them detailed information about human technology and tactical knowledge that could help them resist council pressure. The response was immediate and overwhelming, as communication networks throughout the galaxy carried messages from oppressed species who had been waiting for someone to show them that resistance was possible. Bei Young, me, coordinated the release of information that exposed corruption and abuse throughout the council hierarchy and showed how the promise of peace and prosperity had been used to justify exploitation and control that benefited only the ruling species. Her reports contained evidence of resource extraction that had impoverished entire worlds and cultural suppression that had destroyed the heritage of dozens of civilizations and military actions that had been hidden from the galactic public for centuries. Most damaging revelations concerned the true purpose of Protocol 7 and how new species were systematically weakened and controlled through technological dependency and psychological manipulation that made them unable to resist council authority. As the truth spread through council space, the political situation became increasingly unstable, and species that had supported the existing order began to question whether their loyalty had been misplaced and whether change might be possible. The Council's response was predictable and desperate, and involved threats of massive retaliation against any species that supported human rebellion and promises of reforms that everyone knew would never be implemented. But their threats were empty because human ships had demonstrated that they could strike anywhere at any time, and their promises were worthless because too many species had heard them before and had learned that council words meant nothing. Admiral Veltos found his magnificent fleet surrounded by human vessels that had appeared without warning and seemed to know exactly where his ships would be at any given moment, and his communications were jammed by devices that his technical experts could not locate or defeat. The final message came from Kang Tae-min, who spoke directly to the council leadership from their own station, where he had been hiding in plain sight while coordinating the entire operation. His words were calm and respectful, but carried an authority that could not be ignored as he explained that the age of council dominance was over, and that the galaxy would now be governed by principles of equality and voluntary cooperation rather than fear and control. He offered the council a choice between peaceful transition to a new galactic order or continued resistance that would result in the complete collapse of their civilization and the loss of everything they had built over thousands of years. The offer was generous considering the circumstances, because humans could have simply destroyed the council and imposed their own rule. But instead, they proposed a federation where all species would have equal rights and responsibilities. The council had 48 hours to make their decision, and during that time, human ships would remain in position around every council world ready to act if their offer was rejected or if any attempt was made to organize military resistance. The Great Chamber fell silent as the countdown reached 0, and delegates from 847 species sat motionless in their seats while the weight of their decision pressed down upon them like the gravity of a dying star. 48 hours had passed since Kang Tae-min delivered his ultimatum, and during that time the council had debated and argued and pleaded for alternatives that did not exist because the humans had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the old order was finished. Some delegates had proposed fighting to the end rather than accepting defeat, but their military advisors had explained with brutal honesty that resistance would only result in the complete destruction of everything they had built. Over millennia of careful expansion, others had suggested negotiating for better terms, but the humans had made it clear that their offer was final and that any attempt to modify the proposal would be interpreted as rejection and would result in immediate military action. The Velthari representative sang a mournful melody about the end of an age, while the Mordun delegate pulsed with colors that had no translation in any known language, but conveyed a sense of loss so profound that even their enemies felt sympathy. At exactly noon Galactic Standard Time, the vote was called, and one by one the species that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years signaled their acceptance of defeat and their willingness to participate in the new federation that the humans proposed. The margin was not unanimous because some species chose to abstain rather than actively support the transition, but there were no votes against the proposal because everyone understood that opposition would be futile and dangerous. Ryu Seong-ho entered the chamber wearing simple clothes that marked him as a being of no particular importance, but his calm confidence and the way other humans deferred to his judgment showed that he carried authority that needed no symbols or ceremonies. He was followed by Jang Mi-young, who carried economic projections and trade agreements that would restructure galactic commerce in ways that benefited all species rather than concentrating wealth among the Council. Elite Ko Jin-woo brought security protocols and defensive arrangements that would protect smaller civilizations from exploitation while maintaining the stability that had made galactic civilization possible. The three humans took their places at the center of the Great Chamber where the energy sphere had once displayed Council authority, and began presenting their plans for the new Galactic Federation with a competence and attention to detail that impressed even their former enemies. Ryu Seong-ho spoke first about the philosophical principles that would guide the new government and explained how democratic representation and equal rights would replace the hierarchical system that had concentrated power among a few dominant species. His words were translated into hundreds of languages, but their meaning was clear in any tongue, because he was describing a future where every species would have a voice in decisions that affected their lives and where cooperation would be voluntary, rather than enforced. The Federation would be governed by a council where each species had representation proportional to their population and technological contribution, but where no single civilization could dominate others through size or military power alone. Jang Mi-young presented economic reforms that would eliminate the tribute system that had drained resources from weaker worlds and redirected wealth toward the Council Core worlds for centuries. Her proposals included trade agreements, based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, and development programs that would help primitive species advance at their own pace without becoming dependent on more advanced civilizations. The new economic model recognized that prosperity was not a zero-sum game where one species could benefit only at the expense of others, but rather a cooperative enterprise where everyone could improve their condition through voluntary exchange. Ko Jin-woo outlined security arrangements that would protect the Federation from external threats, while preventing any member species from using military force to coerce others into compliance with their wishes. The new defense forces would be integrated units with personnel from many different species, working together under unified command, but with strict limitations on their use and accountability to civilian governments rather than military hierarchies. Each species would maintain the right to defend its own territory, but would also contribute to collective security through shared intelligence and coordinated responses to threats that affected multiple civilizations. The most revolutionary aspect of the new system was the provision for peaceful withdrawal from the Federation by any species that chose to pursue independence rather than continued membership in the galactic community. This concept was unprecedented in galactic history because the Council had never allowed member species to leave once they had been integrated into the system, and the right of secession represented a fundamental shift in thinking about political authority. The humans explained that voluntary association was stronger than forced compliance because species that chose to participate would be more committed to making the system work than those who had no choice about their membership. Over the following months, the transition proceeded with remarkable smoothness as human administrators worked with council bureaucrats to transfer authority and restructure institutions according to the new democratic principles. Many former council officials found that their skills were still valuable in the new system and that humans were more interested in competence and experience than in punishing those who had served the previous government. The intelligence networks that had monitored and controlled subject species were transformed into communication systems that facilitated cooperation and cultural exchange rather than surveillance and suppression. Species that had been forced to suppress their own cultures in favor of council-approved customs began celebrating their heritage and sharing their unique perspectives with the wider galactic community. The Zephyrian Tree People composed songs about the wind between stars, while the crystalline Velthari created sculptures that captured light from distant suns, and the gaseous Morden painted pictures in the vacuum of space using controlled atmospheric emissions, trade routes that had been restricted to benefit Council Core worlds were opened to all species, and new routes were established connecting previously isolated civilizations to the galactic marketplace. Within a year, the economic benefits of the new system were apparent to everyone, as increased trade and cultural exchange led to innovations and discoveries that benefited all member species. Scientific research expanded dramatically as species that had been forbidden to pursue certain technologies were allowed to develop their own solutions to local problems and share their discoveries with others. Medical advances developed on worlds with unique environmental challenges proved applicable to species facing similar difficulties on distant planets, and agricultural techniques perfected in harsh conditions helped other civilizations improve their food production. The most significant change was in the attitude of member species toward the Federation government, because they knew that their participation was voluntary and that their voices would be heard in decisions that affected their lives. 5 years after the signing of the Terran Accords, the transformation was complete, and the galaxy had settled into a new pattern of cooperation and mutual respect that seemed impossible during the final days of Council rule. Kang Tai-min served as the first human representative to the Galactic Federation, and his office became a symbol of the new order where beings from across the galaxy could bring their concerns and know they would receive a fair hearing. The plaque on his wall read, "We came in peace, prepared for war, and chose cooperation," and visitors often asked about its meaning, and he would explain that humans had always believed that the best way to achieve peace was to be ready to defend it. The success of the Federation attracted attention from species beyond the original Council territory, and applications for membership arrived regularly from civilizations that had heard about the new system and wanted to participate. Some applications were approved immediately, while others required careful evaluation to ensure that new members understood and accepted the principles of voluntary cooperation and democratic governance. Galaxy had learned that diversity was a source of strength rather than a problem to be managed, and that different species could work together without sacrificing their unique characteristics and perspectives. Children grew up in a universe where they could travel freely between worlds and learn from teachers of many different species, and where their futures would be determined by their talents and efforts rather than the circumstances of their birth. The old fears and prejudices that had kept species apart for millennia gradually faded as increased contact and communication revealed that differences in appearance and culture were less important than shared hopes and dreams. Artists and scientists and philosophers from dozens of worlds collaborated on projects that would have been impossible under the old system, where knowledge was restricted and cooperation was limited to approved channels. The human revolution had succeeded not through conquest or destruction, but through the simple demonstration that there was a better way to organize galactic civilization based on respect for the rights and dignity of all sentient beings.